Draft resistors. In 1967, former Olympic boxing light heavyweight gold medal winner Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay, refused to take the oath of induction into the Army after being drafted. He was found guilty of draft evasion, but remained free on appeal until 1971, when the Supreme Court overturned his case. By 1968, about 10,000 draft resistors, people unwilling to serve in the military after being drafted, had fled the country for Canada. The nation's youth became increasingly divided, as some chose to fight for the United States and Vietnam, while others sought deferments to go to college. A large number of minorities who could not afford the cost of college responded to the draft and went to Vietnam. The attitude of American youth became increasingly hostile toward the Johnson administration and all war-related issues. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson announced his decision not to run for a second term as president. This was largely due to his low popularity rating as a result of his Vietnam War policies. The 1960s political and social upheaval. Some political analysts who studied the events of 1968 believed the nation had survived one of the biggest tests of its political institutions since the Civil War. The 1960s had been shaped by two movements, the Civil Rights Movement and the anti-war movement. The political turmoil of the decade helped produce great social upheaval, especially among the nation's youth. Some young people became disillusioned with traditional American values. For the first time in the United States history, thousands of Americans flaunted the use of illegal drugs, often popularized in rock music. Many young Americans referred to themselves as hippies or flower children. They claimed to be searching for a freer, simpler way of life. Communal living attracted thousands of youths who adopted lifestyles foreign to older Americans. Some spoke of a generation gap between youth and people over 30. The Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War also divided Americans. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in April 1968 and Robert F. Kennedy in June of 1968 heightened emotions, resulting in demonstrations and riots. Look at the chart of key events in 1968. In the month of January, you have North Vietnam launched the Tet Offensive using Soviet-made jets and weapons for the first time. In March of 1968, you had Eugene McCarthy, a peace candidate and leading Dove, won the Democratic presidential primary in New Hampshire. Robert Kennedy announced his candidacy for president, and President Johnson announced that he would not seek re-election. In April 1968, American forces in Vietnam reached 549,000, and the deaths of the war reached 22,951. North Vietnam announced its willingness to enter into peace talks, and an assassin claimed the life of Dr. Martin Luther King. In May of 1968, preliminary peace talks in North Vietnamese began, but serious negotiations would not take place for another 7 years. In June, an assassin claimed the life of Robert Kennedy shortly after his victory in California for the Democratic presidential primary. In August of 1968, the Democratic National Convention nominated Hubert Humphrey amid the worst political rioting and demonstrations any convention had ever experienced. Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, inherited a divided party and sought election in a divided nation. And in November of 1968, Nixon won the 1968 election, beating Humphrey. So let's move over to page 305. Nixon and the end of the Vietnam War. By 1969, President Richard Nixon faced a national crisis. The Vietnam War had turned into the nation's most costly war. American support for the war was at an all-time low, winding down the war. Nixon did not bring an end to the war right away. In fact, for a time, he widened American military activities, attacking North Vietnamese supply routes out of Laos and Cambodia. This expansion of the war in Indochina caused increased human and financial losses for the United States. The Vietnamization Nixon called for Vietnamization of the war, or a takeover of the ground fighting by Vietnamese soldiers. Both Kennedy and Johnson had favored the approach, but neither had been able to make it work. While Nixon promoted Vietnamization, he also bombed neighboring Cambodia, which he claimed served as a base for North Vietnamese guerrillas. The bombings triggered a large student protest in Kent State University in Ohio. But by the time the National Guard broke up the demonstration, 4 students lay dead and 9 others wounded. More and more Americans were questioning the role of the United States in Vietnam, yet President Nixon increased bombing raids on North Vietnam through 1970. Peace with honor. Nixon's chief foreign policy advisor, Henry Kissinger, met in Paris with North Vietnamese officials seeking an end to the war. For several years, negotiations remained deadlocked. Finally, in January 15, 1973, Nixon announced that peace with honor had been reached and the ceasefire would soon take effect. The War Powers Act. It's the chart right here. The War Powers Act, passed over President Nixon's veto in 1973, gave Congress more power in dealing with international conflicts. We look at the first arrow on the left. It says the president can send troops overseas but must inform Congress within 48 hours. The middle one, it says troops may not stay overseas more than 60 days without the approval of Congress. And then the last one to the right, it says Congress has the power to force the president to bring troops home. The War Powers Act. In November 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act over Nixon's veto. This law helped reverse the precedent set by the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave the president sweeping powers in Vietnam. The War Powers Act included the following provisions. We just read them. We'll move on. Page 306, Vietnam and limits on the United States' power. When the United States finally withdrew from Vietnam, the North Vietnamese overran South Vietnam. For 2 years, the United States poured billions of dollars of aid into South Vietnam. However, on April 30th, 1975, the government in Saigon collapsed. Bitterness over the war persisted. When the president asked for funds to evacuate the South Vietnamese who had helped the United States, Congress refused. In the end, some 100,000 people fled the country. The United States had tried for 20 years to guarantee freedom to the people of South Vietnam. However, the United States ultimately could not count its efforts as a success. In the conflict, some 58,000 Americans died and another 300,000 were wounded. The United States spent over $150 billion on the war effort. Not only did the Vietnam fall to communism, but so did the neighbors, Cambodia and Laos. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, the United States sought to understand the Vietnam experience. It was the subject of films, books, and national monuments, such as the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. It's that black wall with all their names engraved on it. Conclusions drawn from the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The following is a list of conclusions drawn from the Vietnam War. Vietnam era. The American political system acted in response to a variety of public pressures. Modern war technology was not always powerful enough if an opponent was armed with a determined spirit of nationalism, pride in one's country. Successful military efforts required a well-prepared and supportive public. Compare, for example, the differing experiences in Vietnam and World War II. The United States was committed to a foreign policy that supported the global nature of United States involvement in foreign affairs. The United States questioned the role as a police officer in the world. The President of the United States should learn from the lessons of Vietnam when foreign policies are considered that could cause loss of American lives as well as great financial costs, and military spending during the Vietnam War era negatively affected domestic programs. So we'll move on. We're on page 307, Chapter 9, Section 3, the arms race and changes in U.S. foreign policy. So we'll skip the section overview. We'll just go right down to the paragraph. It says the arms race. The United States used the first atomic bombs in history in August 1945 in Japan in a successful effort to bring World War II to a close. As you read in chapter 8, the use of these atomic bombs caused major loss of life and destruction. This also began a dialogue about the mortality of nuclear warfare. The morality of nuclear warfare, In 1949, the Soviet Union showed the world that it too had developed the atomic bomb. The United States and the Soviet Union became rivals, and the nuclear arms race began. The two nations began by stockpiling nuclear and non-nuclear weapons. The United States explored a hydrogen bomb in 1952, and the Soviets tested 1 year later. Both nations rushed to develop missiles capable of carrying nuclear weapons. The balance of power became a balance of terror. In 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower announced the Atoms for Peace plan at the United Nations. The plan called for the United Nations supervision of a world search to find peaceful uses for nuclear technology. The Soviet Union refused to participate. Americans were encouraged to build fallout shelters in homes, schools, and public buildings to enable survival in the case of nuclear attack. In 1957, the Soviets launched a satellite, Sputnik, into orbit around the Earth. The arms race then became a space race as the United States rushed to launch its own satellites, some for military purposes, changing relations with the Soviet Union. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union rose and fell during Eisenhower's time in office. Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union since the 1920s, died in 1953. In time, Nikita Khrushchev took over as the head of the Soviet government. This change marked a temporary easing of Cold War tensions as the Soviets began to focus more on improving conditions within their own nation. Peaceful coexistence. Relations between the superpowers gradually improved. In 1955, the leaders of the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain and France held the first summit meeting since World War II in Geneva, Switzerland. The superpower leaders began talks to disarmament that. Talks on disarmament that, in time, led to suspension of nuclear testing. Poland and Hungary. In 1956, riots by Polish workers won concessions from the communist Polish government. Inspired by this, students and workers in Hungary began demonstrations that ended with the Soviet Union sending tanks and troops to bring the nation firmly back under communist control. The suppression of the Hungarian revolt cooled relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. Camp David. Relations improved again in 1959. Khrushchev visited the United States. Khrushchev and Eisenhower held lengthy talks at Camp David, the presidential retreat near Washington, D.C. The spirit of goodwill that grew at these talks encouraged the leaders to announce another summit meeting in Paris in 1960. The U-2 incident. The Paris summit proved a disaster. Shortly before it opened, the Soviet military shot down an American U-2 aircraft deep within Soviet territory. The pilot admitted that he had been spying on Soviet military bases. Cuba. In 1956, Fidel Castro began a revolt against the government in Cuba dictator Fulgencio Batista. When the revolt ended with Castro's victory in 1959, the United States quickly recognized the new government. Castro, however, soon adopted policies that angered the Eisenhower administration. He limited civil liberties and imprisoned political opponents. He also nationalized key industries and turned to the Soviet Union for aid. Castro was turning Cuba just 90 miles from Florida into a communist nation. Large numbers of Cubans fled Castro's rule, with many settling in southern Florida. Some worked actively to end Castro's rule. Meanwhile, they became an immigrant group that contributed to the richness of American multicultural experience. The Kennedy administration. By 1960, President Eisenhower, a Republican, had completed 2 terms in office. John F. Kennedy, a Democrat, won the presidency in the election in 1960 in a very close race against Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon. The space program. Following the successful launch of a Soviet cosmonaut, the first man in space in 1961, the President Kennedy committed the nation to a space program with the goal of landing a person on the moon by the end of the 1960s. In 1962, John Glenn became the first person in orbit in the Earth. In July 1969, 6 years after Kennedy's death, astronaut Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon's surface. The effort cost some $25.4 billion. Kennedy and Latin America. The United States has been deeply